celles qui ont organisé cette conférence qui est tellement importante. Et un merci tout spécial à tous ceux qui sont présents ici aujourd'hui, parce que c'est grâce à votre travail et à votre leadership que vous aidez à bâtir des communautés plus fortes, plus justes et à garder les Canadiens en santé. L'obésité est non seulement un enjeu de santé publique, c'est un enjeu de justice sociale. Et on a chacun et chacune un rôle à jouer pour mettre fin à la stigmatisation, briser les stéréotypes et veiller à ce que tous les Canadiens et Canadiennes aient accès aux soins de santé dont ils ont besoin. Obesity is a complex public health issue. It's related to all kinds of inequality and injustice, from lack of mental health support to discrimination and poverty. And this organization is doing incredible work to raise awareness, fight stigma, and make sure people living with obesity receive the care and support they need. So everyone here is part of that. Thank you so much for everything you do to support Canadians build a healthier, more equal country, because you're touching so many lives. Du fond du cœur, merci from my heart to yours. Thank you.
Well, bonsoir, good evening. Bienvenue à Ottawa. I'm Arya Sharma. I'm the Scientific Director of the Canadian Obesity Network. And on behalf of the network, on behalf of its over 20,000 members, on behalf of the Board of Directors, the Science Committee, the Program Committee, the Summit Planning Committee, the Student Committee, and all the other committees, the sponsors, the exhibitors, it's a great pleasure and honor to welcome you to this meeting. We acknowledge today that we are gathering on the traditional and unceded Algonquin territory. And if you do the math, you'll realize that this being a biennial meeting, this one being the 6th one, that we've been doing this now for 12 years. And I can tell you that in those 12 years, having been involved in this organization for 12 years and having seen the landscape in Canada change in 12 years, I can confidently say that we are moving the needle on obesity, both on the prevention side but also on the treatment side. 12 years ago, when we launched the Canadian Obesity Network at the time, it was a very academic type of exercise. There wasn't really much of an obesity community across Canada. There was a lot of obesity research going on, but it was in silos. We realized very quickly that people working at the same institution, people working in the same departments on different aspects of obesity hadn't actually even met each other and weren't even aware of the other obesity research that was going on at their own institution. That has certainly changed because since we've started having these summits, we have actually succeeded in building a community amongst obesity researchers, amongst clinicians, amongst policymakers, in fact, amongst all of the stakeholders who have an interest in this topic. And the summit is the gathering place where we bring everybody together. And I'm sure those of you who've never been to an obesity summit will leave here with new enthusiasm, new friends, new colleagues, and probably new ideas about how you want to address the issue. Those of you who've been at a summit before already know what's in store for you, so I'm sure you're looking forward to all of that. Now, we've come a long way in the last 12 years. If I can have the first slide. Obesity Canada, the first thing that you will notice is that this is really the first Obesity Canada Summit. All of the previous summits were the Canadian Obesity Network. The name change happened earlier this year. We went from being a non-profit, or as I call it, a non-for-loss organization. We were trying hard not to lose money. We have now become a health charity, and we're now the health charity that worries about obesity in Canada. So the vision of the network, well, I keep saying network, but it's now Obesity Canada, is to be Canada's authoritative voice on evidence-based approaches for obesity prevention, treatment, and policy. Our mission ultimately is to improve the lives of Canadians affected by obesity. And when I say that, I'm not just talking about people living with obesity, because when you have a family member who has obesity, when you have a colleague who has obesity, when you have a dear friend who has obesity, when you have a neighbor who has obesity, you are affected by obesity. Obesity affects us all. And we think we need to address this issue to the advancement of anti-discrimination, prevention, and treatment efforts. And that's what we do. And we do this by having 3 very clear strategic goals. The first one is addressing the social stigma associated with obesity, because I'm convinced that if we do not change the way that we look at obesity, and when I say we, are we talking about health professionals, researchers, policymakers, but also the general public. we are not going to make progress in this field, and we will not be able to do justice to the needs of people living with obesity. And this means we need to change the way that policymakers, health professionals, researchers, and of course the general public approaches obesity. And we have to improve access to evidence-based prevention and treatment resources for those who are already affected by obesity, and we have to get serious about preventing this problem from happening to people who don't yet have the problem. Now, in terms of membership engagement, Obesity Canada is still a very small organization. Nevertheless, as many of you might have noticed, earlier this year, actually it was earlier last year, we launched a new website. This is a completely new website. The site is completely bilingual. We've expanded our social media reach. We now have about 25,000 people who follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and webinar views. Just think about it, 30,000 views of online webinars on the Obesity Canada website. We now have 13 local chapters. We need more local chapters. If there's anybody in the room who's thinking about having a local chapter, starting a local chapter, there is going to be a workshop specifically dedicated to how do you get a chapter started, and you're going to learn from the people who have been doing this very successfully across Canada. We currently have 21 student and new professional chapters, students and new professionals. If you hear the term SNPs being thrown around, we're not talking about single nuclear polymorphisms, we're talking about our students and new professionals, and you'll see them all over this conference. They're a huge part of what Obesity Canada does. We now have 89 certified bariatric educators. Those of you who were at the last meeting in Banff would remember that was the launch of the program, and I think it was the first 20 or 25 of them got their certificates after taking the exam in Banff. That number has grown, and it continues to grow. We now have 3,500 health professionals who have taken our online CME courses. Many of you know, and I can see many faces in the room who are directly involved in the work that's going on currently on creating the Canadian the Obesity Canada and CAPS guidelines, practice guidelines on obesity management. And the team that's working on these guidelines has actually just completed a review of over 550,000 articles looking at the evidence on all aspects of obesity management, and that is just in adults. The work on pediatric obesity guidelines is just starting. Although we are Obesity Canada, we are a pretty international organization. Just to mention it, we actually have attendees at this conference from, I believe, 14 countries right now. But Canadian Obesity Network staff and people who are associated with the network have actually attended over 30 conferences across the country and have visited 15 different countries because other countries are now looking to Canada for advice on what do we do about obesity, because there are many areas in which Obesity Canada has certainly taken the lead where, I can modestly say we are slightly ahead of the game, probably by a couple of minutes, than other countries. We have ramped up our advocacy issues. We've had meetings with MPs, with MPPs, with MLAs, I believe in almost every province by now, and there's more of those coming. On Monday, we have a whole day on the Hill, and there's an evening reception with MPs and with senators, informing them about the need to take obesity more seriously. Somebody did the math on this, and Obesity Canada staff has traveled 600,000 miles, or I believe it's kilometers, in the last year, going to all of these conferences, but also traveling across the country. And we can't even begin to count the hours that staff has put in, not just organizing this meeting, but for all of the activities that Obesity Canada has been doing. The one thing that we've really taken seriously, and I think it's fair to say we are probably the first scientific obesity organization that has taken this on front and center, is the concept of nothing about me without me. We now have people affected with obesity on every single one of Obesity Canada's committees, from the science committee to starting from the board of directors, the science committee, every committee including the clinical practice guideline committee. There is not one committee or working group within the Obesity Canada that does not have patient representation or public representation and engagement. The activities of Obesity Canada's patient advocates in terms of attending meetings, attending conferences, giving talks, meeting with politicians, doing advocacy work, attending all of the different events that are organized by Obesity Canada across the country, now number over 75. These are all volunteers and are happy to put their time in, and you're going to see them at this conference. You're probably going to see them in every session because we take this mandate extremely seriously. The big news today was the launching of the report card. Many of you will remember that 2 years ago we launched the first report card, and creating this report card on access to treatment is a lot of work. This is a full-time job for somebody for at least 12 months, trying to figure out exactly, what is the access to all of the different obesity services in every province, and what are the policies, and how do you do it, and who do you call. You look at all the guidelines, you look at the large databases from CIHI and the insurance coverage databases to create the report. I'm not going to go into details in the report. All I can say is there's a lot of room for movement in this. There are some areas where there has been improvement since in the last 2 years, but unfortunately, lots of the things that we looked at in this report card got an F 2 years ago, and I must sadly say there's still a lot of Fs in this report card. Obviously, we know that things, change. Somebody today, we had a policy meeting this morning, and someone said, this is like trying to turn the Titanic, and that's exactly what this feels like. So we are seeing progress, but the progress is slow, but needs to be faster. If you want to see the full report, read about the methodology, et cetera, it's all online. The website went live this morning, so you can access it. There's one feature on that website when you go to it that I think we should all take advantage of. You can directly click on a link on that website. All you need to enter is your email address, your name, and your postal code. And you will and then at the click of a button, you will be sending a personalized letter to your provincial or territorial MPs and to your federal representatives. And I think everybody in the room should do this. And if you have anybody else that you know who could do this, I hope you share this through social media, because we need to start advocating for this. And it's very easy to do. All of this work would not be possible without support, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of our focus partners. If there's anybody in the room who wants to be a focus partner, come see us, because we really need the support. When it comes to the funding of the organization, I just want to point out that currently Obesity Canada has no government funding whatsoever. There's no operational funding. Most of our funding comes from research grants or focus partnerships, from the events we run, like the summit. This summit, if this is the attendance, we are kind of breaking even. If we get more attendees, we might end up with a little bit of profit or revenue, if you want it. And we desperately need that money. One number that we are kind of really happy about is, because we've never had this before, is the donations. Now, $13,000 might seem like not much, because if you think about it, there's 7 million people living with obesity in Canada. If we got $1 from each one of them, we would have $7 million. So when you think of it that way and think about 13,000, it doesn't sound a lot. But we are very optimistic that as people get to know this organization, as people get to engage in this organization and start seeing the work that this organization is doing, people will start opening their pocketbooks. And if there's anybody in the room who wants to make a donation, all you have to do is go to the website. There's a pop-up window that comes. You click on it. You can, we accept all currencies, PayPal and MasterCard and whatever you have. And in fact, we will even accept cash sent in envelopes, because I can tell you, we get those envelopes in the office every now and then. I think last week there was somebody, it was a $10 note in an envelope. That was it. Anonymous. We don't know who it's from. If that person is in the room, thank you very much. These are the people that make it happen. Obesity Canada is a very, very small organization. In fact, we only have 3 full-time staff. Everybody else is either on contract or is volunteering their time. But these are the people who make all of the things that I've talked about happen, including this meeting. So having said all of this, I'd once again like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank the sponsors. I'd like to thank the organizing committee. I'd like to thank my team for all the hard work. And I know that we are going to have a great week over here. So having said all of that, I'd now like to hand over the microphone to Lisa Schaefer, who happens to be a public relations and marketing professional who's based in Vancouver, but she's also the chair of our public engagement committee. And I'm going to get her to talk to us about their activities, and then also to then introduce David Macklin, who will introduce our awardee. So over to you, Lisa.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. This is a bigger room than I thought it was going to be. Bear with me. So, as I was introduced, my name is Lisa Schaefer, and I am one of the members of Obesity Canada's Public Engagement Committee. We like to call ourselves PEC. It is an honor for us to be included in the Obesity Summit, and you'll have the opportunity to hear from the members of PEC over the next few days. We'll be sharing our patient stories, we'll be hosting some panels, and we will be looking to meet as many of you as possible. We want to find out your stories as well, so indulge us when we stop you in the hallways. The PEC committee members bring firsthand experiences of living with obesity, and we strive to elevate the voice of the millions of Canadians affected by it. Our mission is to empower people with obesity by educating patiently and credibly, advocating passionately, and inspiring consistently. This Saturday, we are hosting our first ever public event day, and we are beyond thrilled to say that it is a complete sellout. So if you don't have your tickets, Brad might be scalping some later, I'm not sure. But truly, this is a testament for the need for these kinds of events and opportunities. There's a vibrant community of people that are seeking connection, understanding, and education about the disease that they live with. I have lived with obesity for over 40 years, and I can honestly say there is no aspect of my life that has not been impacted by obesity and the stigma that is attached to it. Obesity has been in my family for generations, and as such, I not only inherited a genetic tendency for it, but I also inherited generations of shame, really poor coping mechanisms, and a false narrative that I am somehow incorrectly human, and that situation is of my making. I cannot begin to tally the number of calories that I have counted, the number of hours I have spent in a gym, the amount of money I have spent on books, diets, and false promises, or the amount of time of my life that has been consumed with the feeling that I am a total failure. Luckily, I am now wiser. I am better informed, and I have a new perspective on how to navigate life with obesity. But that came after years of tears. When the incorrect narrative that obesity is simply a matter of poor personal choices and a lack of willpower is perpetuated, we are damaging lives and ignoring facts. The facts are, obesity is a chronic disease. It is complex. There is no one cause, and there is no one cure. We need to reframe our view of obesity and treat it with the respect, dignity, and resources given to other chronic diseases. Individuals living with obesity are strong, productive, and valuable members and contributors to Canada. We deserve to be heard and demand improved access to treatment and care. You'll be hearing from us. Weight bias and weight-based discrimination are prevalent in Canada. They contribute to health and social inequities. Every Canadian deserves the right to be treated with respect in healthcare, education, and workplace settings, regardless of their size or their disease. The bias and stigma of obesity is a subject matter that I am very passionate about. In the last year, there was one story of one Canadian that hit very close to home for me. I would like to share with you the story of Ellen Bennett. I do not know Ellen. I never got to meet her, but she certainly seems like she was my kind of lady. After living what sounds like a very dynamic and interesting life, Ellen died of cancer. And in her obituary, she took the time to call out the fat shaming she endured from the medical profession. After years of feeling unwell, Ellen sought out medical intervention, and no one offered her any support or suggestions other than weight loss. Her obituary reads, Ellen's dying wish is that women of size make her death matter by advocating strongly for their health and not accepting that fat is the only relevant health issue. I hear you, Ellen. I'm grateful for her words, and I'm grateful that her words spread far and wide. It's a wake-up call. Ellen's death happened on our watch. Can you imagine using your obituary for such a selfless act? These words are important. She used her voice and the power of her experience to influence and educate. Each one of us has that exact same power. You have the power to educate and influence from whatever position you hold. I hope you can join us in changing the narrative around obesity. By being here today, you're taking an amazing first step. Second step, please click the link on the website so we can spread the word far and wide. It's much needed change for millions of Canadians. So thank you. I would now like to invite Dr. David Macklin up. Dr. Macklin is a lecturer at the U of T. He is a member of the Science Committee with Obesity Canada. He's an amazing family doc, and he runs a few weight management programs at both MedCan and Toronto's Mount Sinai Hospital.
Well, thank you, Lisa. That was very powerful, and my wish is that your words travel far and that you affect much positive change to people who struggle with this true and complex and genetically conferred and environmentally influenced medical condition. So thank you for your words. So each summit, Obesity Canada will solicit nominations for researchers and scientists who excel and demonstrate innovation in fields of science that are particularly important to the mission of Obesity Canada. And this year's winner is truly a star. Kevin Hall is, I'm going to suggest, kind of like a library book. You know, we loaned Kevin to the United States. He went down in like 1999, and you know, like all really good information-filled, important library books, you kind of want them back eventually, right? So he's back today to help let us read some great information that he's going to share. A little bit of background: his bachelor's was at McMaster, his PhD in physics from McGill. He's now a tenured senior investigator at the NIDDK and part of the NIH in Bethesda, Maryland. His main research interests are really fascinating stuff that focuses on the regulation of food intake and metabolism and energy balance and body weight. These incredible mathematical models that he might share today that for a clinician have been incredibly helpful to help communicate to someone living with obesity really how the brain responds and how the body responds under the influence of weight loss, and how there's a defense against weight loss. These incredible mathematical models that I suggest you go check out in his award-winning body weight planner. It's used by millions of people to help predict how diet and physical activity dynamically interact to affect human body weight. And now, in true Canadian fashion, you know, Kevin suggested that I don't really need to list all of these awards that he's won, so I won't go through this really impressive long list of awards that he's won. But I think we can assume that one of his maybe most prized ones will be the award being given him today, which is the Distinguished Lecturer Award from Obesity Canada. So, ladies and gentlemen, Kevin Hall.
Thanks very much. It's good to be home. It's good to breathe a sigh that there's no wall at the border yet. It's been an interesting experience living in the Washington, D.C. area over the past couple of years, let's just say that. But no, it's a real honor to receive this award and to be invited back to Canada to kind of tell you a little bit about some of the research that we've been doing at the NIH, a team of folks at the intramural research program there, which is a really exciting place to do research. Some of the younger people who are interested in doing postdocs, contact me because we've got openings available. But what I want to focus on is actually no math today. So there'll be no math in the talk whatsoever. I'm sure everybody's happy about that. And what I'm going to focus on is these aspects of the diet wars, the things that I'm getting entirely sick of, but seem to kind of, on nutrition Twitter, seem to kind of occupy most of my time. We used to think that obesity was all about dietary fat. Seems now it's all about carbs and sugar, and you can just forget about calories entirely. Or is it even a little bit more subtle? Is it about the quality of the calories that you're eating? And so what I want to focus on is, some of these questions and some of the research that we've done to investigate that. So, it probably didn't start, but in kind of recent memory, Atkins published his book in 1974, I believe. This was the first edition. And the thing that was kind of interesting was that they made a promise, not that this was just one diet that was going to help people, but on this diet you could actually eat even more calories than you were eating before. And the subtitle of the book was actually The High-Calorie Way to Stay Thin Forever. And so this was very attractive, and I think at one point, there was 10% of the U.S. population was on the Atkins diet, which is amazing to me. But the idea here was that if you just cut carbs enough, somehow your body would respond by increasing the number of calories that you were burning, so that you could even eat many more calories than you were eating before, and yet burn those off and lose weight and lose body fat and therefore have the high-calorie way to stay thin forever. It's an interesting promise. These kinds of topics were sort of tested over the years, and I'll describe some of those tests, but it sort of received a little bit of a resurgence in more recent years, primarily out of Dr. David Ludwig's lab at Harvard University, who has proposed a more sweeping view of obesity as being really driven by carbohydrates and insulin. How many people have heard of this carbohydrate insulin model of obesity? Just raise your hands. Okay, so almost everybody here. But the basic idea, and this is a slide I stole from Dr. Ludwig, the basic idea is that the thing that's really driving obesity in this view is, whatever makes fat cells fat is going to make people fat. And one of the things that we know drives fat storage and inhibition of fat release from fat cells is the hormone insulin. That's just basic biochemistry and endocrinology. And the other thing that we know very well is that dietary carbohydrates result in increased insulin secretion. So according to this model, if you're overeating carbohydrates and increasing your insulin secretion, you're going to increase your fat storage. And as a result, you're basically sucking metabolic fuels into the fat cells. The number of those fuels that are circulating in the blood, glucose levels, lipid levels, are postulated to go down, at least at certain times of day. And that's going to lead you to increase your hunger, increase your calorie intake, and decrease your energy expenditure. And so the way that this model works then is they basically say that the metabolic effects of carbohydrate to increase insulin cause the adipocyte, that's the fat cells, to take in, store, and trap too many calories, and subsequently energy expenditure declines and hunger increases. And so the clear solution to this problem then is to cut carbs in your diet. That will decrease insulin secretion, that will release the fat that's trapped inside fat cells, and relieve this depression in circulating fuels, which will increase energy expenditure, and that'll be the high-calorie way to stay thin forever. And in fact, you won't even be as hungry, and you'll probably eat less calories as well. So this is the effortless weight loss that's promoted according to these low carbohydrate diets, and especially, refined carbs like sugar and flour will be particularly potent stimulators of insulin secretion and trapping this fat inside the fat cells. Some folks have gone even further and said that maybe you can't even lose fat unless you cut carbs. So Gary Taubes, who's a relatively famous science journalist, has written extensively on this topic, and he says that any diet that succeeds does so because the dieter restricts fattening carbohydrates, and that those who lose fat on a diet do so because of what they are not eating, the fattening carbohydrates. And the observation here is that if you ask people what they're eating, even if they're following a low-fat diet and losing weight, well, they'll also be cutting carbs from where they started. So they're cutting carbs, they're cutting fat, they're cutting calories. How do you know that this person is losing weight and losing fat because of the calories they cut, the fat that they cut, or the carbs that they cut? And it's an interesting question. Those are confounded variables. The only way you would know the answer to that question is that if you took some people at baseline who are maintaining their normal weight, and you only cut carbs in their diet, keeping fat and protein at baseline, or you only cut fat, keeping carbs and protein at baseline, and you compared those two things. And in fact, we did that experiment. So we brought some folks, 19 men and women with obesity, to the NIH Clinical Center, where they stayed for a pair of 2-week periods. And on one occasion, in random order, we cut 30% of their baseline calories, all coming from carbs. That's the blue box here, the reduced carb diet. Fat and protein, as you can see, were kept at baseline. And on another occasion, we kept the same people for another 2 weeks at the NIH Clinical Center, and we kept carbs and protein at baseline, and we only cut fat. That's the red bars here. And so you can see that these people are both cutting, or these same folks are cutting the same number of calories, in one occasion all coming from carbs, and the other occasion all coming from fat. And so the carbohydrate insulin model makes some predictions here. It says that only the carbohydrate reduction should give rise to a decrease in insulin secretion, and therefore only that diet should release the fat that's trapped inside the fat cells and therefore increase energy expenditure. Those are some pretty clear predictions. Whereas we know that fat in the diet doesn't really change insulin secretion much. And in fact, when we measured insulin secretion by measuring 24-hour urinary C-peptide, which is C-peptide's a molecule co-secreted with insulin but only cleared by the kidneys, and so by counting it in the urine, you can figure out how much insulin was secreted over the course of the day. You can see that these same folks, when you cut carbs in their diet, they had a little bit more than 20% reduction in insulin secretion, whereas when you cut fat in the diet, there was no change in insulin secretion that we could detect. So we're setting this system up for a nice test of this carbohydrate insulin model. At the NIH, we have metabolic chambers where people can live for a day or two at a time and measure on a minute-to-minute basis their carbon dioxide production and their oxygen consumption, and the ratio of those two things gives you the respiratory quotient. And all you need to know about that number is that the closer that number is to 1, it means that you're burning a greater proportion of your calories are coming from carbohydrate oxidation. The lower the number, closer to 0.7, means that you're burning a greater number of calories coming from fat oxidation. And what you can see here is that before we introduce these diets at day 0, these folks are burning a mixture of carbohydrates and fats, right? So RQ of about 0.86 or 0.87. When we switch them to the reduced carb diet, you can see that the respiratory quotient, it goes down, meaning that you're shifting more to fat burning mode. And so that makes sense. If the carbs are going down and the insulin's going down, you're releasing the fat from the fat cells, and you're supplying the body with more energy from fat, and the body burns the fat. And so it shifts more towards fat oxidation. So that looks good for the carbohydrate insulin model. The reduced fat diet, the red boxes here, suggests that when you cut fat in people's diet, nothing happens to the amount of fat that's being burned, which is kind of interesting. And so when you think about it, burning more fat doesn't necessarily mean that you're losing more fat. And what really matters is the balance between how much fat that you're eating and how much fat that you're burning. So in one case, we had the situation where we kept the fat in the diet the same, and now we're burning more fat, so we're going to lose body fat. That's the reduced carb model. In the other case, we are burning the same amount of fat, but we cut fat in the diet, so we're also going to lose fat. And the question is, which one wins, if any? And the answer was, in complete contradiction to the carbohydrate insulin model, the reduced fat diet led to statistically significantly greater fat loss, albeit I would say clinically meaningless amounts of fat loss more. But we can certainly discount Gary Taubes' notion that the only way to lose fat is by cutting carbs in the diet, right? If these folks only cut fat in the diet, they clearly lost fat and a little bit more than they did when these same people cut the same number of calories from carbs, albeit these are very small differences. And those differences show up as slight differences in the number of calories expended by the body. After all, we have to obey the first law of thermodynamics. We have to account for all of these calories. And so, for example, during the sleeping period or during the 24-hour period, only the reduced carbohydrate diet led to a reduction in the number of calories burned. Now, again, that's opposite to the carbohydrate insulin model, right, which is supposed to lead to this high-calorie way to stay thin forever, right? In fact, energy expenditure went down with the reduced carb diet, whereas it did not go down significantly with the reduced fat diet. So that's kind of interesting. And when we published that paper back in 2015, the low-carb community went crazy, and this is when I first got my first dose of the vitriol of the diet wars. Mark Hyman, who's somehow affiliated with the Cleveland Clinic, I don't know how that's possible, but he was writing a book called Eat Fat, Get Thin at the time, and he devoted a page or so to just this one study. And he said, you know, that got some press, and you really should just don't worry about it because there were some real problems. First of all, the low-carb diet, it's not low-carb. It's only 29% carbohydrate. You have to really get down to 10% carb or lower to really get this effect. And secondly, it's a very short study. It was only 6 days, and it's conducted on a metabolic ward where all the food is provided. It shows what happens inside a vacuum, but not in real life. Well, no, we provided people with air. They weren't in a vacuum. But the real point that he's getting at is that there's this concept called fat adaptation, the idea that if you just waited long enough on this lower carbohydrate diet, maybe the respiratory quotient would dip down even further, so you'd be burning even more fat than we observed. And that would lead you to at least catch up to the reduced fat diet, maybe even surpass it. And of course, we didn't do that experiment, right? We didn't do it long enough to know the answer to that question. It looks to me like it's sort of plateauing after 6 days, but of course I can't rule out that this might have taken another nosedive later. And again, we only had a 29% carbohydrate diet. So we did another study. This time we did 2 months where people stayed with us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 2 months at the NIH Clinical Center. And the first 4 weeks, they ate a baseline diet that was high in carbs, high in sugar, kind of normal amounts of fat and protein. We adjusted their energy intake to match what they were burning inside the respiratory chambers. In each green box here is a 2-day period spent inside the respiratory chambers. And then after 4 weeks of that diet, we kept the number of calories constant. We kept the amount of protein constant, but we decreased carbohydrates to 5% of total calories and increased fat to 80% of total calories. So this is a very low carbohydrate, something called a ketogenic diet. This is kind of similar to what Atkins had recommended in the early phases of his diet program to increase ketogenesis. And the primary thing that we were interested here was, since we wanted to wait long enough, what was the energy expenditure on the last 2 days when they were in the respiratory chambers on the ketogenic diet compared to the last 2 days when they're eating the same number of calories on the higher carb, high sugar diet? And that was the primary aim of our study. So what did we find? There was no effect. So much for the high-calorie way to stay thin forever. There is no effect on 24-hour energy expenditure. That was our primary pre-specified outcome. But that's just comparing the last 2 days on each of those diets. Remember, that's just 2 of those green boxes in the previous slide. We have the data for all of them, and so we could look at that as an exploratory analysis, and something kind of interesting happened. At the onset of the ketogenic diet at time 0, you can see that energy expenditure does actually go up just a little bit, and then it sort of decays back down towards baseline, which is kind of interesting. And the reason we think that that happened is because you have cut now, insulin secretion goes down by 50%. So the body is sort of standing on its head to adapt to this new fuel mixture that's coming in and shifting what it's doing in order to provide the body with enough glucose. So gluconeogenesis goes up because you're not consuming very much carbohydrates anymore. And in fact, we can see some of that in the nitrogen excretion in the urine because some of those glucose molecules are being formed by amino acids. And as that process ramps up, that requires ATP, which costs energy, and therefore we think that this is the reason we see the spike in early phase energy expenditure as a result of ramping up gluconeogenesis. And we see that here in the urinary nitrogen excretion going up. Now, urinary nitrogen excretion is going up, which means that you're going into negative nitrogen balance because we kept the amount of nitrogen in the diet, the protein in the diet, the same. So it means that you're sort of losing some lean mass here as well. And in fact, it offsets some of the loss of fat, so that the fat loss actually slows down at the onset of the ketogenic diet, which is kind of, again, counter to what the carbohydrate insulin model would predict. And what about this fat adaptation phenomenon? Well, I think you can see here that this change in respiratory quotient was pretty much complete within the first week. It did not take another nosedive. There's no evidence to suggest that over the course of the 28-day period that there was a further decline in respiratory quotient. You can guess what people say. Well, it needs 6 to 8 weeks to really get the fat adaptation. I can't rule it out, but the data doesn't seem to support that notion. Okay, so that's just 2 studies done by our research group. Now, I mentioned earlier on, this concept has been studied ad nauseum for decades. In fact, we did a systematic review and meta-analysis of all of the controlled feeding studies that have kept calories the same and have varied carbohydrates and fat, and also keeping protein the same. We found 32 such studies. And what we found was that if you look at the energy expenditure differences, there's a highly statistically significant effect favoring the lower fat diet. But this is a great example of where statistical significance means nothing from a clinical perspective, because the magnitude of that weighted mean difference is 28 calories per day, okay? This is completely meaningless, and the range of fat and carbs that are being exchanged here is huge. What this tells me is that the body does a pretty darn good job of adapting and is more or less as efficient on these different diets. And it's amazing. I mean, evolution sort of made this to be so, right? That we could survive in a variety of different environments, eat a variety of different kinds of diets, widely varying in carbohydrates and fats. And if there was a group of people that magically started losing weight when they, went up north and were eating a low-carb diet, they would have been selected against, right? They would have lost weight and died. So it's not magic, but it's really interesting physiology, and that's some of the stuff that we've been studying. Similarly, we looked at the subset of studies that looked at body fat changes, and again, you can see that there's a highly statistically significant difference in body fat changes for the same number of calories, favoring the lower fat diets, again, 16 grams per day, okay? Clinically meaningless. The body does a really good job of making it so a calorie is almost a calorie when it comes to exchanges, isocaloric exchanges of carbohydrate and fat. At least that's what I thought until November of last year, when the New York Times told me that this was not the case. A low-carb diet can help you maintain a healthy weight, and adults who cut carbs from their diet and replace them with fat sharply increase their metabolisms. Okay, this is interesting. Maybe those 32 studies that have been done before haven't been done long enough, or they haven't isolated the right kind of physiology. And when we went to look and see this paper, it was actually a very interesting study done by David Ludwig's group at Harvard. And what they did was they did a weight loss period so that subjects lost 10% of their body weight. And then they were randomized to receive either a high, a moderate, or a low carbohydrate diet. And in these parallel arms, they had their energy expenditure measured using the doubly labeled water method. So this is actually a weight loss maintenance study, and they're provided with all of their calories to try to maintain their weight loss over this period of 20 weeks. So very long study. It's outpatient. It's not done on a metabolic ward like our studies, but they provide all of their food. So really interesting study, and the question that they were asking was whether or not energy expenditure at the midpoint and at the end of the study was different than some other time point. And in fact, you can see that in the bottom here with the red lines, those are the doubly labeled water measurement periods or energy expenditure periods. And so you actually have two potential points of comparison. You could compare their energy expenditure before they lost the weight to see if energy expenditure went down differently on the different diets, or you could compare it to the period right after the weight loss. In fact, while they're actually trying to stabilize them at this new body weight. So there's two potential points of comparison. And if you read the paper, they say the pre-weight loss value, rather than the post-weight loss, was originally specified in the registry as the anchor point for calculating the change scores, but this error was corrected. Okay, that's kind of interesting. What they mean is that they pre-specified that they would calculate their energy expenditure change relative to the pre-weight loss period, not the post-weight loss period, but then they changed their mind for some reason. And that was a mistake. They'd made a mistake. What they don't tell you in the paper is that they made that change after all of the subjects had finished the study. So they actually published all of the data, the individual subject data, so we could actually reanalyze it to see what it was like according to the pre-registered endpoint. After all, that was the only one that's pre-specified. And this was the results of the paper that was published. And you can see that they're comparing energy expenditure versus the high carb group. And it was not statistically significant for the moderate carb group, of about 100 calories a day greater. But the low carb group was 250 calories a day greater than the high carb group. So that's something, right? That's actually kind of an outlier according to our previous analyses. But that's using their revised anchor point versus the post-weight loss time point. If we analyze the data according to the way they pre-specified it, you can see the effect kind of goes away. It's kind of interesting. It's also interesting, so this is again part of the diet wars. We pointed this out and published a preprint on this, and David Ludwig went on Twitter and he said, you know, this has been attacked by a few critics. Our response is that if you do a weaker analysis, you know, you get a weaker result. Meaning if you do the weaker analysis, the pre-specified one, you get a weaker result, no big surprise. Someone commented, then why did you originally plan a weaker analysis? He didn't respond to that, but it's interesting. So the doubly labeled water method actually doesn't measure energy expenditure. It measures carbon dioxide production. And regardless of which anchor point you look at, there was no significant differences in carbon dioxide production. You actually have to make an assumption about that respiratory quotient that I was telling you before in order to translate the carbon dioxide production into an energy expenditure measurement. And what you can see here is depending on the assumed difference in respiratory quotient, you can get almost any result you want. So if you assume the maximum value, which is a respiratory quotient difference of 0.11, which was what was assumed in this particular study, you get 200 calories a day or so difference. But as this number is reduced, this difference is reduced, the effect size decreases and the significance goes away. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about this study is even though they provided these subjects with all of their food, And they're estimating the respiratory quotient based on them adhering strictly to the dietary food that they're giving them. They actually are eating about 500 calories a day more than they were giving them. And that's just by looking at their body weight change and how many calories they said that they were burning. So they're clearly not sticking to the diet. So there's some missing calories that are unaccounted, that are off-study calories, that are likely not going to match exactly the diet that they're assigned to. And so some uncertainty in those unaccounted calories leads to some pretty substantial uncertainty in the respiratory quotient. So I would say that this is a really interesting study, but it doesn't provide strong support that low carbohydrate diets give you this high calorie way to stay thin forever. Okay, well, what about energy intake? Does the composition of the diet influence energy intake? There was a really nice study that was done by Christopher Gardner's group at Stanford and published last year in JAMA called the Diet Fits trial. And he assigned people, this is an outpatient, this is not controlled feeding, just assigning people to a lifestyle intervention to cut carbs or cut fat. And what he found was that over the course of the 12-month period, there was no significant difference between low-fat and low-carbohydrate diets. Although at 3 months and 6 months, the people on the low-carbohydrate diet had slightly more weight loss. Again, probably not clinically significant difference. We worked with Christopher Gardner's group to use an objective method that I'm not going to have time to talk about to analyze what the calorie intake changes were underlying both of these different groups. And you can see that early on, the red curve with the low-fat diet, people are cutting slightly less calories. But that difference between the red curve and the blue curve for the low-carb and low-fat diets really dissipates over time. It really kind of merges together and is going backwards towards baseline. And that's a whole separate talk about why the curve has that shape. But the point here is that if there was really a huge benefit to alleviating hunger or promoting satiety of low-carb or low-fat diets, then you should see a big difference between these two things, and you don't. So it suggests to me that there probably isn't a huge effect of carbs versus fat, at least for the average person, on satiety and hunger. Now, one of the purposes of this Diet Fits trial was that there's a huge variability. There are some people who are tremendously successful on low-carb diets and some other people who are tremendously successful on low-fat diets and other folks who gain weight on both of those diets. And right now, we just don't know how to tell who's going to be who. We also don't know whether or not the person who was really successful on the low-carb diet would have been equally successful had they been randomized to their low-fat diet. In other words, is this really driven by biology, or is it driven by more about their social behaviors and their economics and their support systems and things like that? We don't have answers to those questions, and I think that those are really active areas of research. But this study was because both of these groups had similar recommendations with respect to changing the overall quality of the diet. What do I mean by that? Both groups were told to cut out added sugars, for example. And so the low-carb folks say, oh, well, that's all the effect, right? Of course, that's why the low-fat diet folks lost weight, is because they cut added sugars. And in fact, it was reported this way in the New York Times. They said the key to weight loss is diet quality, not quantity, new study finds. Well, that's not really what this study found, right? There was no control group that had a poor quality diet that lost less weight. And even though Christopher Gardner is very much all about trying to improve the quality of people's diets, and in fact wanted all of these subjects to improve the quality of their diet, that was not what this study was designed to do. And that's certainly not a conclusion that was supported, but it does raise the question of whether or not this does lead us to a way to kind of transcend these diet wars. And I've adopted this Civil War picture from my adopted home these days, symbolizing these diet wars of low carb versus low fat, or plant-based versus animal-based, or whatever this is. Is there something that they could all agree on? And I would argue that there is something that they all agree on, because at the end of the day, they all have this common theme of avoiding ultra-processed food. And so I took this was a nice report by Jean-Claude Mubarak that was funded by the Canada Heart and Stroke Foundation, talking about ultra-processed food and its contribution to calories, and almost 50% of calories in Canada are from ultra-processed foods, defined by this NOVA classification system originated in Brazil. But the idea here is that the food supply and the food system has changed remarkably since pre-obesity epidemic times, such that we now have a greater supply of calories in these ultra-processed forms. And one of the hypotheses is that something about the processing of these foods and their convenience and maybe their energy content, or maybe even the salt, the sugar, or the fat, as Michael Moss's book has talked about, is contributing to overeating and potentially driving the obesity epidemic. Now, I'm a physicist by training. I'm sort of a reductionist at heart, and this struck me as a little bit odd, right? It's an interesting idea, but what is processing? What does that mean? I mean, there's a nice classification system, but is it really just about the salt, the sugar, and the fat, right? If that's true, then if I design two diets that are matched for salt, sugar, and fat and calories, and I present them to people, and they have different levels of processing, then maybe it shouldn't matter, right? Maybe they would eat the same amount. So we recently did that study. We presented people with double their estimated energy requirements and instructions to just eat as much or as little as desired. And 20 adults were instructed to do this. They were presented 3 meals a day, and they had ad libitum access to snacks. The meals had the same amount of calories, the same amount of carbs, fat, protein, sugar, sodium, and fiber. And the idea here is that if there's something about the ultra-processed foods that drives excess calorie intake, then we should be able to measure it. And so we brought these folks in for a single month of inpatient stay, and we measured every morsel of food that they ate over the course of a month. And in random order, they had 2 weeks on the ultra-processed diet and 2 weeks on the unprocessed diet. We actually got the good news this morning. This paper is accepted in Cell Metabolism, so it'll be out in the next little while, but you can see a preprint at this URL at the bottom. So just to kind of go over the basics here, this is an inpatient study. Everybody gets both the ultra-processed diet and the unprocessed diet for 2 weeks in random order. We do a whole bunch of other measurements that are detailed in the paper. The primary outcome is ad libitum energy intake. So what happened? Well, despite being matched for calories, carbs, sugar, fat, sodium, protein, and fiber, people overate about 500 calories per day more on the ultra-processed diet compared to the unprocessed diet. And you can see it's a pretty consistent effect over the entire 14-day period. When you break it out over the averages over these 14 days, it was entirely constituted from carbohydrate and fat overeating. Protein was matched entirely between these two diets. They ate the same amount of protein, the same people. It's kind of interesting. They gained weight on the ultra-processed diet, and these same folks lost weight on the unprocessed diet. You can see over the course of each 14-day period here how much weight was lost and gained. And we made DEXA measurements on these folks, and they gained fat on the ultra-processed diet and lost fat on the unprocessed diet. And when we quantify those things, you can see that they're highly statistically significant. Again, over such a short time period, they're not clinically meaningful weight and fat changes, but it's kind of striking to me that despite matching for all of these properties of the diet, that there were these huge differences in energy intake. And in fact, the differences in energy intake explained a lot of the differences in body weight. Some of these folks ate more than 1,000 calories a day differently between these two diets, despite being presented with the same number of calories, the same amount of carbs, fat, sugar, sodium, protein, and fiber. Others ate more or less the same, and they didn't gain or lose any weight at all on these two different diets. We don't know what explains why some people responded this way and not others, but on average, it was about a 500 calorie a day difference and about a 1 kilo gain and a 1 kilo loss, so a difference of 2 kilos on this chart. So coming back to the original question, is it the carbs, is it the calories, or is it the quality? This last study seems to suggest that the quality of the foods influences weight via the calories that the people eat. Whereas all of the studies that we've done and other people have done controlling calories and manipulating carbs versus fat, for example, don't seem to have much effect on body fat change or energy expenditure for that matter. And at least over the long term, there doesn't seem to be much effect on energy intake either. So that's what I have to say, and this is work that's done by a vast quantity of people over the years. The folks highlighted in blue are former students and postdocs. If you're a younger person in the audience or has interest in coming to the lab to do these kinds of experiments, please contact me. And thanks for your attention, and again, it's a great honor to be back in Canada.
Step on this side of you.
Sure.
On behalf of Obesity Canada and the Science Committee, I award you the Distinguished Lecturer Award. Thank you for the talk.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Great. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Kevin, for that wonderful talk. And when people find out that you work in obesity, one of the most common questions that I get asked is, so Dr. Sharma, what do you think about the keto diet? And you've given me a lot of ammunition. I mean, you haven't changed my beliefs about the keto diet, because I've always felt that it was a bit of nonsense. But you've given me sort of the scientific rationale. And it's surprising to see how many people are actually science and fact resistance working in this field. And interesting enough, the people who seem to be science and fact resistant often are also the people who are selling bestsellers and who have weight loss clinics that follow some kind of, I don't want to call them scams, but idealized belief systems. Which when you actually practice medicine, you kind of have your doubts. So thank you very much for enlightening us about this. Those of you who have an interest in nutrition, I just want to remind you that tomorrow morning you'll have the opportunity of actually hearing Canada's response to all of this research, because we will be talking about the new Canada Food Guide, which of course by now probably everybody in the room has had an opportunity, but you'll actually hear from the people who created the guide. And so those of you who have an interest in nutrition, tomorrow morning in this room is going to be the plenary session on those aspects. So having said that, you might have noticed by now that this year's summit is green. A lot of summits lots of conferences are going green, which means that we have a very limited amount of print copies of the program. If you absolutely need a print copy, I think they're available for purchase at the registration desk. But you don't really need one, because the entire program is on the app, which you can download for free, and I'm guessing that by now you've actually all downloaded it. Now, apart from the scientific program that's on the app, I want to draw your attention to what I think is probably as important, and that is the social program on the app, because anybody who has been to an Obesity Canada meeting knows that we pay as much attention to the social program as we do to the scientific program. In fact, there's a whole committee that worries about the social program. And we give this to the people who are the most competent about running social programs, read partying. And that is our student and new professionals, because they seem to know the best places. They seem to know what has the most fun. And in fact, the first social event kicks off this evening right after the networking reception, which is going to happen next door following this opening ceremony. Once once you've attended the networking reception, you're all invited to come up to the, I think it's called the President's Suite or whatever it is. It's a large suite on top of the hotel that has a wonderful view of the hill. There's a nice outdoor area, so you're all invited to come up there. And and they'll make you work because there is apparently a trivia competition. They haven't told me what the questions are going to be. I don't have the answers. But knowing these events, it's going to be a lot of fun. So you're all invited to that. Most people who attend these events, I've never heard regrets about attending the events, apart from the fact that they sometimes go late and then you have a problem in the morning. Particularly if you're planning to attend the yoga session that starts at 6 o'clock. I've heard, not experienced, but heard that there have been instances where people have moved straight from the social event to the yoga session. It's not the recommended mode of action, but whatever rocks your boat. I'd also like to draw your attention to the mentorship workshop or breakfast that happens tomorrow. And I hear that there's a very limited number of tickets still available for this. Again, this is one of the featured events here. Anybody who's thinking about maybe perhaps worrying about their future careers, not clear, do they want to do academia? Do they want to do a postdoc? Do they want to go work for industry? Do they just want to retire early? I have no idea. There will be an opportunity to talk to people who have done it all. And that's going to happen tomorrow morning. And I believe there's somebody at the back where you can get your tickets. Who's the person? Raise your hands. Okay, I don't see a hand raised, but I was told that there's somebody at the back where you can get those tickets. So once again, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out. I'd like to thank, again, all the committees that have worked hard. I'd like to thank the staff that's worked hard for the meeting. I'd like to thank all of our sponsors and exhibitors and supporters and everybody else who has made this happen. And I'm quite confident that you're going to have a very exciting week. And I certainly look forward to meeting all of you in person and seeing a good turnout despite the social event tomorrow morning when the sessions start here. I will probably not be at yoga. Thank you very much.